Even though our criminal justice system is one of the best in the world, it can be flawed, and sometimes injustice can occur because human beings are making these decisions and human beings are flawed.
On this episode of the Creator Community, we'll meet Alexandra Shapiro, a mother and partner and co-founder of a prestigious Manhattan law firm with a passion for criminal justice reform. We'll hear what it's like working for Ruth Bader Ginsberg and having Justice Ginsburg preside over your wedding, along with the many gray areas that exist in our legal system. We'll follow Alexandra's journey from a career as a federal prosecutor to why those gray areas inspired her to switch to defending those accused of white-collar crimes and appealing high-profile cases. We'll hear how all this led to Alexandra publishing her new legal thriller, Presumed Guilty. Check out the show. Welcome to the third season of the Creator Community. This is a podcast series from book publisher New Degree Press, or NDP. I'm your host, John Saunders, founder of Forward Advisory Solutions. This show is designed to celebrate, elevate, and showcase many of the incredible authors that have published their books with NDP. This year, 2021, NDP will cross over 1,000 published authors. In this show, we get to know the authors and their books, as well as give you a behind-the-scenes look at their journeys. We'll find out what it takes to bring a book from an idea to being available wherever books are sold online. It's no easy task, nothing worth it ever is. But with solid structure, coaching, and community, it's very much attainable. Today, I have with me Alexandra Shapiro. Alexandra is a former federal prosecutor and one of the nation's leading appellate lawyers. She has argued in the Supreme Court, won numerous appeals resulting in the exoneration of previously convicted criminal defendants, served as president of the New York Council of Defense Lawyers, and handles many high-profile cases at an elite New York litigation firm that she co-founded. When she isn't writing or hard at work in her legal career, Alexandra enjoys photography and the great outdoors and spending time with her husband and 3 children. Her book, Presumed Guilty, has a mid-January 2022 target publishing date and will be available wherever you buy books online. Alexandra, welcome to the show.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me. It's great to see you.
The pleasure is all mine. Great to see you as well. So quite an interesting journey you've had working in the legal system. Let's start there. Let's walk through that journey a little bit, if you would, before we jump into the book.
Sure. Well, I graduated from law school in the early 1990s and started my career in Washington, D.C. as a law clerk, first for a federal appellate judge on the D.C. Circuit, which is sometimes called the second highest court on the land, and then clerking for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsberg in her first year on the Supreme Court. And after that, I decided to move back to New York City, where I grew up, and become a federal prosecutor. And I joined the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York and did that for about 5 years. And then after that, I went into private practice for the first time and worked at a large international law firm for about 10 years, mainly focusing on white-collar criminal defense, appeals, and some civil litigation. And then about 12 years ago, I co-founded my law firm, Shapiro, Bach, and I've been practicing in this small firm environment that I founded ever since.
Quite an extensive background you have in the legal system, no doubt about it, and working on both sides of the fence, if you will. Maybe for those who don't know what it's like clerking for Ruth Bader Ginsberg, what was that like? Any nuggets you can share from that time in your life?
It was great. She was one of the best bosses I've ever had. She was, on the one hand, very demanding, and what she really expected was excellence. And so you really strove to do your best. And she also was an incredibly nice and warm human being who always cared about, our families, and would often actually perform marriages for her clerks. She did that for me as well. And she was just a great mentor. And it was a wonderful experience because it was her first year on the Supreme Court. And although she'd been a judge for about 12 years and so had tremendous experience as a jurist, the Supreme Court was different and new to her. And it was really exciting to go through that sort of first year, helping her learn and, adjust to her new role.
She literally married you.
She and a rabbi, I will point out. Exactly.
That is incredible. So I see where if you had any passion for the law, it's certainly that added on to it, I'm sure, and working for what sounds like an extraordinary leader that isn't probably a great example for many. Where do you think your passion for law came from before you even got into it? What drove you to the legal industry?
So I would say a couple of things. One is that I think law is a career that provides many different options, and there are many different ways you can really make a difference on both a micro and a macro level. On a micro level, helping clients negotiate whatever types of problems they're facing. And on a macro level, if you work for the government as a lawyer or for a public interest group, or even, when you're representing individual clients, there are opportunities to help shape the development of the law and move it in a more positive direction in different areas. And so that was one real driver. And the other thing is that it can be very intellectually challenging and a great career for people who are intellectually curious. So for instance, as a litigator, although I do quite a bit of criminal work, I have a pretty wide variety of cases that I've worked on during the course of my career. And you could, one day, you're learning about a clinical trial for a drug for Alzheimer's and why the trial failed in one case. The next you're learning about technology for high frequency trading. I've had another case where I learned a tremendous amount about different forensic science and that was relevant to a murder case. So you can be exposed to a lot of different industries, technologies, and different types of people from all walks of life. And so I think it's the variety is really as well intellectually challenging and can be exciting over time.
I don't know that I've ever, given it much thought at all, but certainly from your story there, how much it is a right and left brain career and profession. And what a great way for somebody who has an intellectual curiosity, as you clearly do, to go about their life and learn all these different things along the way. That's really fascinating to me. Thanks for sharing that. So you started out as a federal prosecutor and then found yourself at some point switching over to the defense side in appellate cases. What was the switch there? That seems like a big jump for those of us who might not be familiar with federal prosecutors.
So I'd say a couple of things about that. When I became a prosecutor, I don't think I ever really thought it would be a long-term sort of career that I would do for the rest of my life. I always thought at some point I'd do something different. And I really enjoyed being a prosecutor. I enjoyed the public service aspect. And quite frankly, the whole sort of cops and robbers aspect of it was fun, a lot of fun. But there came a point where I decided that I wanted to try my hand at actually representing real people, individuals who faced, very serious problems, either under investigation by the federal government or state for criminal offenses, or actually already having been charged and having to defend themselves. And another aspect of it was during my 5 years in the U.S. Attorney's Office, I probably spent most of my time doing violent gang cases and other serious crimes. And I didn't do too much white collar work. And so I got to a point where if I had stayed, I think I would have transitioned to focusing exclusively on white collar work, probably securities fraud. And when I looked at the cases that unit was doing, it seemed like the most interesting and complex were cases in which I would say they sort of covered areas that were gray and not clearly criminal. So for instance, areas where conduct might seem to the prosecutors to be potentially unethical or wrong, but it was less clear that a line had been crossed and that what was the conduct being investigated was actually a crime. And very challenging and interesting, it seemed to me personally that I would prefer to be on the defense side. And I'm a bit of a libertarian, and I believe strongly that criminal law needs to be clear and that people shouldn't be punished, unless it's clear that they broke a rule. And I thought I would be more comfortable trying my hand at defending people in those kinds of cases.
So you saw that what many of us probably aren't that aware of is that there's a gray area in the legal system, and sometimes there's a little bit left to interpretation. And maybe there was an opportunity for you to help some folks that maybe weren't getting a fair go at it, if you will, and that drove you to go over and move to the other side to work on defense and appeals cases. I'm hearing that right?
Yes, absolutely.
And so
You've been working at this now for some time, and you've come to writing a book. What was it that brought this book into your universe?
So two things. I mean, first of all, like I'm sure many people, I've always really wanted to write a book. And I think what really kind of finally drove me to take the plunge and become an author was a case I handled a few years ago. I took it as an appeal. I did not try the case, but my client in that case was a banker who, in the course of basically doing his job and following what industry practices were at the time, worked on a very large foreign exchange transaction, and then 5 years later found himself charged with wire fraud. And I strongly believe that he didn't do anything wrong, and that there was no way he could have known at the time that this conduct, which, as I said, was sort of standard in the industry, would be deemed by U.S. authorities to be wire fraud. And I handled his appeal. And unfortunately, although I've won many appeals for criminal defendants, I lost this one. And, on top of the unfairness in him having been charged with a crime for basically, in my view, doing his job, his trial had unfairness as well. And he testified on his own behalf. And during the course of the trial, the judge instructed the jury that a defendant's testimony should be viewed in just as any other witness with an interest in the outcome, and that the jury should consider that such a person has a motive to lie. And I believe this really vitiates the presumption of innocence that is a bulwark of our system, because a person who is innocent and testifies on their own behalf does have an interest in the outcome, but has a motive to tell the truth. It's only a guilty person that has a motive to lie. And I brought this issue as well to the attention of the appellate court. And even though two other similarly situated defendants around the same time had received new trials, the court denied my client a new trial. And he's still sitting in prison. And this case essentially keeps me up at night. And, I really wanted to tell that story. And so my original concept was to write a nonfiction book about that case, but I was a little concerned that the actual facts are very complicated, and I wanted to reach a very wide audience. And at an early stage, I had a conversation with Professor Eric Custer, who runs the book creator group that helped me accomplish this goal. And his first question to me when I told him about this case and my concern about sort of the complexities was, well, why don't you write a novel, write a fictional story? And I thought that was a fantastic idea. So that's what I've done.
Wow. So one of the few cases that didn't go your way, and clearly one that still, as you said, keeps you up at night. This was a big part of the why you wanted to get this book out there. And through talking to Eric Custer, the book coach, manuscript coach, helped you guide you to going from nonfiction to this fiction lens that really, I think, gave you a lot more latitude in telling the story. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's, so I think we got a good sense of the why behind your book there. So what is Presumed Guilty about? What else should we know about the story that you're sharing?
Sure. So it's entirely fictional. All the characters are made up, and as is the plot. But it tells the story of a woman named Emma Simpson, who is a portfolio manager and the head of the New York office of a big-time hedge fund. And she is a woman who has 2 teenage kids, a husband. She lives in Dutchess County, New York, and works in Manhattan. And one day, March 14th, 2012, she has a very typical day. She makes her long commute. She goes to her office, has a lot of meetings, interacts with people, deals with tons of email like everyone is forced to these days, goes home to her family. And then about a year later, her whole world gets turned upside down because prosecutors charge her with for a federal crime based on a very short email she dashed off on her way home, in which she told other employees at the company to follow a company policy called a document retention policy. And so the book basically takes you through her journey as the target of a federal prosecution and how it affects her and her family, and what are the motivations of the prosecutors. And so I tried to, it's very realistic, I believe. It's a lot of the dialogue and other things are based on my real experiences as a lawyer, but the details and the characters are all made up.
So fictional characters, but have some semblance of reality based on just your history. And here's a woman who got caught in the crosshairs of federal prosecutors and not necessarily understanding why from just sending an email about company policy to her employees. That's unbelievable. And here she finds herself on the wrong side of the law and having to defend herself, right? This is the story. How would you say your experience as a criminal lawyer shaped this story or helped enrich it?
So there are a lot of different points where there'll be different types of events. So for instance, the prosecutors interview witnesses in what we call a proffer session. And I believe the dialogue is very realistic in terms of the way the things prosecutors would say, the witness and how, in this case, he feels during this interrogation. And similarly, with respect to the trial, I tried to present, it's obviously, it's much shorter than it would be in a real case, but, there are opening statements, there's cross-examination and all of that. And I think, it's very realistic in terms of the way people are speaking and the kinds of things that happen during the course of the trial. In addition, in this case, the prosecutors work out of the Southern District of New York, and there are aspects of the story where readers get introduced to some of these settings, in the courthouse or in that building, the prosecutor's office, that are sort of realistic based on, my own experience having been in those places as well.
So not only do we get a real sense of how these cases roll out and move through their stages in real life, but we get some visuals of these courthouses around New York City that you've spent some time walking in and out of to really bring us to that moment in time. That's lovely. It sounds like these gray areas in the legal system have, raised some question marks for you. They've gotten you to change the direction of your career, maybe even take on some different cases. What do you see as needed change in the criminal justice system today?
So there are a number of things that I would advocate. Some of them are relevant to the book and some of them are just broader points. But I would say one thing that has come to light in recent years as a big problem is this issue of prosecutors not disclosing exculpatory evidence to defendants in a timely fashion. It's called Brady. So one of the areas that I think there's plenty of room for reform is to put more rules in place to really put teeth into the Brady rule, which requires prosecutors, if they have exculpatory information, to turn it over to the defense. So that's one area. Another area which has to do more with sort of police misconduct specifically, is that there's a doctrine called qualified immunity that basically insulates police officers and other law enforcement officers from lawsuits about misconduct. And I believe that doctrine needs to be significantly reformed so that there are incentives for better behavior by law enforcement officers, and there's more deterrence of the kinds of terrible events we've seen around the country in the last few years that have come to light, I should say, in the last few years. And then another area, and this is kind of dear to my heart as an appellate lawyer, is that very often when something goes wrong in a trial, when there's a ruling that could be very, not only legally wrong, but very unfair to a defendant. For instance, if a judge doesn't let a defendant put on certain kinds of evidence that the defendant believes he or she needs to put on to kind of tell their story and rebut the government's case, the judge doesn't let them do it. Or conversely, the government puts in very inflammatory evidence that shouldn't come in under the rules of evidence. Very often, even if an appellate court agrees that the trial court made a legal error, there's this rule called harmless error that they can trot out to say, well, it didn't matter anyway. And there's so many cases where I believe that rule gets abused because appellate judges are just very reluctant, understandably so, to undo a jury verdict. And they should be reluctant, but I do believe that doctrine needs to be tightened up so there's really more incentives for trial judges to be more concerned about making sure they're really applying the law correctly and being as fair as they can. So those are just a few examples of some of the things that I've been thinking about lately.
I mean, those are some pretty heavy issues you just talked about there, right? George Floyd, of course, made one of those, I think, more relevant and prevalent in the news in the last year or so. And this last one here you referenced about prosecutors taking these, what sounds to me like gray areas of bringing evidence to cases. What drives that? What motivates these folks to do that?
Well, I think there's a variety of reasons. And I want to be clear. I think most prosecutors are acting in good faith and trying to do their best. But I think, human beings are flawed and the criminal justice system is administered by human beings. And so sometimes you have just mistakes. But then also, I would say that there's a problem of confirmation bias that applies to all human behavior, but it can play a role in prosecutions as well. So for instance, if law enforcement officers or prosecutors, form a view that a crime has occurred or that a particular person is the one who committed the crime, often perhaps unconsciously, like anyone else, as studies have shown, rather than gathering facts to try to figure out what happened, they may be unconsciously trying to drive the investigation in a way that confirms their pre-existing beliefs, that something about what happened, instead of kind of trying to look at things from a more tabula rasa point of view to figure out what happened. So I think that's part of it. Hopefully this is not very often, but I do think also prosecutors are humans that have ambitions and motivations, and sometimes their desire to make a big case and make a name for themselves can also be a factor, unfortunately. So I think there's a whole host of reasons. And again, I think most prosecutors are acting in good faith, trying to do the best they can. They have a very important and noble job. So I don't mean to suggest otherwise, but I think we have to just keep in mind that, like all humans, they have flaws. And so we need checks and balances to protect against that.
Confirmation bias is a powerful force, isn't it? So your experience really has given you a great picture of the legal system and proven to us that, right, like anyone, humans are flawed. Just because you're in the legal system doesn't mean you've got it perfectly figured out, and gray areas exist, and therefore maybe they need to be evaluated. And it sounds like you've got a lot of passion around that. Why did you focus on white collar crime in your work, Alexandra?
Well, I thought it was important to show that, if a person who has significant resources can face these kind of challenges from the criminal justice system, then just imagine how much more difficult it is for ordinary people and poor people who don't have the kinds of resources you need to try to fight the government in a criminal case. And so I thought it would bring even more attention to the potential challenges that we face with some of these flaws in the criminal justice system I'm trying to highlight.
So if the people with extraordinary resources can't get it done, what the heck is everyone else supposed to do here, right? If they get caught in one of these circumstances, what a great question to ponder. As you've gone through this book journey and written this book, I recall one of your friends on, I think, your book announcement, I noticed on LinkedIn saying, Alexandra, how the heck did you get this done? How did you find the time? And I would actually add to that, how do you think this has changed you going through this journey?
Sure. So I think that it was difficult to find a time. I did my best to try to do it on nights and weekends. And I think it was helpful to have a development editor through the Creator Institute who, was someone that I had to respond to and keep producing content for. But it was incredibly challenging, and I felt, helped me learn how to use a different part of my brain. So during the course of my career, I do a lot of writing and have always done a lot of writing, but it's analytical, persuasive writing, briefs to courts, things like that. Fiction writing is very different. And, one of the things that I found was really interesting about it, at least for me, and I imagine different fiction authors have different processes, but I would think about a little bit in advance before sitting down to write, about characters, what I wanted my characters to be like, and have kind of a general idea about where I wanted the story to go. But I found that until I sat down and wrote a scene, I didn't really know what was going to happen, and that the actual act of writing would take me in different directions. And I thought that was fascinating, and I really enjoyed it. And so this has piqued my interest, and I'm hoping that I will write another book, and either a sequel to this book or perhaps even at some point explore a different genre. I've always enjoyed science fiction and fantasy. So we'll see where it takes me next. But I have really enjoyed the process of fiction writing. I felt like it opened up a different part of me that I'd like to explore further.
So as you sat down to write scenes, you weren't sure where it was going to go. You had this background, this experience, and a general sense of what's going to happen, the steps that needed to be involved. But when you write when you do your actual work as an attorney, you know the goal, you know the end game, you know where you're headed. So that must have been fascinating to go into the abyss and not know exactly where each scene, each section was headed to. How do you sort of keep it between the rails and even kind of come to a conclusion? That's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to suggest it's totally unstructured, but more just like you get I found that I got ideas as I was writing the scene that would take it in a new direction, or maybe there's a lot of dialogue in my book. And, as I was writing it, I'd come up with new ideas for how the characters were going to talk to each other. So I think at the beginning, actually, I was a little bit nervous because I felt like maybe I should be able to outline the entire plot before I start writing the book. But I didn't do that. I don't know if some authors did that. I really was writing it in scenes, and I knew, there was going to be an investigation, there was going to be a trial. I had some of those basic ideas, but in terms of the real meat and bones, I think got fleshed out during the process of writing. And I thought that was really interesting, and I enjoyed it. It just felt very creative as compared to, writing a legal brief where you know in advance what arguments you're going to make, and where you're going to get to, and you outline it and all of that. And obviously it shouldn't go in a different direction unless it's because you came up with some great new idea because of research you did while you were writing it or something like that. But I found that this kind of liberating in a way.
That's awesome. Liberating in the sense that you could go in you had the general structure of what you wanted to do, but really the details of it, you could take in any which way you wanted to go with it. And I really appreciate this idea that, going through this creative journey sort of opened up this new corner of your brain that maybe had, maybe become a little bit dormant because you hadn't, used it in a number of years. I found a similar experience in my years on Wall Street. I took a pretty significant designation a number of years ago. It took me a year to get and hundreds of hours of studying and all these exams. And after that, I guess not so much creative, but in just a new learning and opening up a corner of your brain. After that, I couldn't stop learning. Not that I didn't already, but it really accelerated my appetite to continue to learn. And that's honestly what drove me to go back to get a business degree. And so I totally get what you're saying, but it's fascinating for you and I in different directions there. Thanks for sharing those details. When you think about this journey, this experience for you, Alexandra, have there been any unexpected positives that have come out of it for you?
I guess one of the things has been the ability to meet so many other authors from different ages, different backgrounds, writing completely different types of books. Most of the authors that I've met through this process have been doing some sort of creative project, but it's not just fiction. There have been poets, there have been a lot of folks writing memoirs and that sort of thing. And that's been just a great experience. Some of them are, college students, others are later in life like myself, but it's been a great author community. And, it's been exciting to discover that I can have another platform besides my job to try to fight for liberty and this cause that I care a great deal about.
That's awesome. So this community really opened your eyes to a new universe, a number of different people working on creative projects. I find it incredibly energizing to be around folks working on a big creation project. And I think most, if not all of us, have found that as you go through it, it really excites other people as well. And here you are now with a legal thriller about to come out in just a few weeks and already excited about moving on to your next book. That's awesome. And it's amazing to me to think that New Degree Press now has published books on every single continent except Antarctica, which is extraordinary to me. So that is a true fact right there that really blew my mind. I learned that not too long ago. So a new medium to express yourself and think about your own work in the scope of a novel. What would you say the key message you'd like to share with the world is from your book, and what might you want people to take away? Even though it is fiction, clearly there's some other issues involved here.
One of the things I want people to take away, and perhaps one of the main message really, is that even though our criminal justice system is one of the best in the world, it can be flawed, and sometimes injustice can occur because human beings are making these decisions and human beings are flawed. And, So those are, I think, really the biggest messages that I hope come across through the book and through my efforts to talk about the book with people.
That's awesome to get that perspective that I don't think a lot of us have, because we just don't work in the legal system and have certainly the experience that you've had over these number of years. So, what's any bigger goals you'd like to share about the book and your work in the criminal justice system as you look ahead?
So, as I said, I hope to raise awareness about some of these problems and encourage people to work for criminal justice reform. And also, despite the presumption of innocence, I think many people still tend to kind of assume that if a person has been charged with a crime, they must be guilty. And I'm hoping to really encourage people to rethink that and to have a more open mind, particularly if, for instance, a person is called upon to serve as a juror. I hope they'll, take this message to heart and really keep the presumption of innocence in mind and make sure that they don't vote to convict unless they're really convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that based on the evidence presented at the trial, that a person is guilty. And then the last thing I would say is that, as I mentioned earlier, there's this sort of issue of gray areas. And the way I like to think about it is often government officials and others become aware of certain business practices, for instance, or other conduct that seems unethical or immoral or bad, but sometimes it's not illegal. There aren't rules against it. And to me, the answer to that situation isn't to punish people who are operating under a framework where that conduct, however unseemly to many of us, wasn't prohibited by law. The answer is to change the law and to regulate, a problem comes to light, let's fix it in the right way, and then only punish people if they break the rules after we've changed them and made them better or more rigorous, if that's a good idea in the particular context. So I would say those are really the biggest goals I hope to accomplish through my work on the book.
I really appreciate this call out to future jurors of America to, go in with, a clean mind, a presumption of innocence, and, help your fellow person out in the court case and go with the facts. That's a really interesting point to make. And thinking about, this gray area that instead of going after these people, let's look at the law and see if it makes sense. It really makes me think of, I had the great privilege to do some work on studying what Singapore does and a lot of things around innovation, particularly in financial services. And in fact, this became part of what you're talking about. It became an issue for them. So instead of basically trying to stifle innovation, what they did was they created what they called a sandbox environment where people could essentially try new things where it might be in this gray area, where instead they were getting shut down immediately, allowing them to grow and find better ways to operate the business. So I wonder if there isn't some kind of corollary there. Thinking about the book and some great things that have happened for you, we got a really interesting quote for you I want to share with our listeners from Peter Ackerman, co-chair of the International Advisory Council for the United States Institute of Peace. He said about presumed guilty, Alexandra Shapiro has written an extraordinary book that takes us into the sad world of the white-collar criminal prosecution while introducing us to characters we both loathe and love. Her exquisite pacing made it impossible for me to put down until the story was fully untold. Sounds like a legal thriller indeed. How did it feel to get that quote back from Mr. Ackerman?
Oh, I was really pleased because obviously one of my goals, which I haven't mentioned thus far, but I guess is obvious, is that I'd like people to be entertained by the story. And I hope that readers will want to keep reading from the beginning to the end. So it was great to hear that at least one reader found it quite engaging and didn't want to put it down. So I hope others react the same way.
Certainly sounds like an entertaining book to me. And based on your experience and your background, being able to really bring us into the courtroom to these cases in a very realistic fashion, but also have a little bit of fun with it, make it entertaining and compelling to read. Alexandra, if people want to learn more about you, where might they go to find more information in the book?
They can go to my website, alexandrashapiro.com, to learn about my book and to learn about my legal work. They can go to my law firm website, shapiroarato.com. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram at Alex_S_author. And I'm on LinkedIn as Alexandra Shapiro.
Great story, great context, really enriched narrative that I think we're all going to find in a compelling page turner. Presumed Guilty will be available this January 2022, wherever books are available online. Alexandra, thanks again for being on the show today. Really appreciate you sharing your story.
Thanks so much for having me, John.
Pleasure is all mine. I'm your host of the creator community, John Saunders. Keep moving forward.